Welcome. I'm Anthony Bila, otherwise known as the Expressionist, and you're live with me and Sony Orms. And yeah, I'm hoping we're gonna have a really awesome time. I'm simulcasting streaming from multiple devices and places. So if you're joining us via YouTube Live, hello. If you're joining us via Instagram Live, hello. And if you're joining us via Facebook Live, hello. And lastly, and absolutely not leastly, if that's even a word, if you're joining us through the Sony Alpha universe, hello. Really excited about today. We're going to be talking about my process, my thoughts on creativity, how I come up with concepts and ideas for fashion photography, and how often that starts to transcend into fine art photography, and how I manage that process with my collaborators. If nothing else that you get from today, the thing that's going to be the most important is talking about collaboration. Collaboration. And yeah, I'm really excited for that. This is also an interactive session, so make sure you send in questions via the Facebook Live or the YouTube Live or on Instagram Live. And I'll do my best to answer as many as possible because I want this to be interactive and a learning experience for everybody involved. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the presentation and talk about my creative process. Now, the thing that's important to remember when it comes to a creative process is that it's not a one size fits all. In the amount of time that I've been shooting and how it's evolved and changed, the process has involved more people as I've gone along. It's become more extensive, more particular, more refined than it was when I started. For instance, you know, when I remember shooting 6-7 years ago, I would just contact someone on Instagram. We'd meet somewhere in the streets of Johannesburg or Cape Town or wherever I would be at the time, and we would take photos. And that process has evolved considerably since then. So what I'm going to do is take us through a couple of slides. And if you're joining us via Instagram, you might not see the slides, but make sure you do visit the Orms YouTube Live or the Facebook Live at some point, because we are going to post this. And you'll be able to see all the slides about me talking about various aspects of photography. So the first aspect that I want to get into are the practical elements, and that really means the nuts and the bolts of what it means to shoot fashion photography. And I will put this disclaimer is that I love the intersection between what's considered traditional fashion photography that you would see in magazines like Vogue and Elle and Harper's Bazaar to this new advent of street fashion photography that became popular, I'd say, about 5, 6 years ago with the sartorialist, with Tommy Ton. And that for me still is a version of fashion photography. It just takes on a whole new life because it begins in the streets versus the editorial and the refined and the print version. But both are still photography and they're still fashion related. So for me, they're quite malleable and interchangeable. So this image is from a collaboration that is ongoing with a very good friend of mine and fine artist named Lunga Ntila. Very talented human being, and we've worked together for a couple of years intermittently and sporadically on a couple of projects, and that's been really, really great to get a different perspective. And like I said before, bring in an element of fashion photography, but also not forgetting narrative and story and what comes with working with fine artists. Because in my mind, you as a photographer have to do this balancing act if you want to shoot fashion photography of understanding the elements and the nuances and the conceptual strength of what fine artists do. And you have to bring in the compositional aspects of what a photographer does. And then you have to make sure you mix those up in your head and create something completely new from those two aspects. So I'm going to start with creative directing. Creative directing is essentially looking at research. I think for a lot of photographers, we tend to look at Instagram or Pinterest and see a shoot that we like and we want to replicate rather than emulate that shoot. And I think that we miss a lot of opportunity to do really interesting work by going deeper and going further. So what I like to do is do a lot of reading and look at old books. If you look behind me, let me switch my angles there. If you look behind me, there are many books, and all of these books are instrumental in feeding my mind before I even come up with a concept. So creative directing, essentially, in my interpretation of it, is looking at the idea from a conceptual standpoint of what do you want to say with your work? What feelings do you want to evoke in people? What conversations do you want to get started? And before you've even picked up a camera or looked at references, that should feed you. And that can come from all kinds of places. I've had references from people like Satoshi Kon, who was an anime director who was really talented, and that's inspired fashion photography. I've read philosophy books. I've looked at news articles. Inspiration can come from everywhere. What's important is taking it, digesting it, and creating a story and a narrative that you can communicate in a visual way that's going to speak to your idea. That's always really important. So for this particular shoot that I did with Lunga, it was all about taking this idea of being gods and demigods and worship and interpreting it in a really interesting way. So Lunga took some photographs of me and I took some photographs of her, and we had this, she had some really great references about draping things behind us and creating this sense of these new gods that exist in the way that we consume social media. And a really interesting analogy that I've spoken to her about is the way that we almost, as soon as you wake up, what's the first thing that you do? You look at your phone. The last thing that you probably do before the end of the night when you go to bed is look at your laptop and fall asleep streaming something, or you're on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or what have you. And that becomes like a new form of time and worship that we give to these devices. And for me, it was reinterpreting that concept into these new gods. So that was kind of the premise behind it. And I'm really excited to share the full project. This is just kind of a sneak peek. And yeah, so make sure you look out for that. So again, with creative direction, research, but also don't use research as an excuse to keep progressing and go, or rather get into the next level of the thing that you want to do. Hey, Lunga, I see comments coming in already. So yes, that's what I have to say about creative direction. And I think the more you do on the research side of wanting to know what you want to say, the better it's going to be when it comes to the next elements of the shoot that you want to do. So the next thing that I want to speak about that forms part of the process is the briefing session. So once you've created your creative concept, it's up to you now as a creative director to think about all the elements that I'm going to speak about, whether that's styling, whether that's makeup, whether it's location, whether it's, you know, building the shot list, all of those elements that I'll speak about. And the more junior or like entry level you are, the more of those elements you're going to have to take on by yourself, which can be very, very stressful. But I think it's important, if you're going to be controlling ideas from a creative director standpoint, that you do that. And again, I'll speak about a recent project that I did that's going to be in faculty press. And even one that I worked on with Lunga, who I'd aforementioned, where she directed a project and I jumped on as a videographer, and she gave direction in terms of how to shoot the thing, the elements that she wanted in it, down to the music and how all of these elements come together. And that's exactly what being a creative director is. And again, it's strange because in the world that we live in, I don't think people exist in these neat little compartments anymore. And as a photographer, there was a time where you could get away with just kind of clicking and shooting. But I think we live in a time where you need to be more diverse, and you need to look at yourself as a creative director that uses these tools as manifestations of your ideas. That's kind of the way that I approach it. So I don't consider myself a traditional photographer because I do so many other things, but photography by and large informs so much of what I do because of the technical aspects of what I've learned about ISO and exposure and f-stop. All of that always plays into everything else that I do. So this example here is from another shoot that I did in studio when we were launching the 7C, and it's called Obscura. And again, I relied on talent and people helping me to produce this project. So if you don't have a stylist that's ready and on call, the easiest thing for you to do is, instead of trying to reach to people that you aspire to be like, that may be professionals and working at these higher levels, I think what's important to do is to consider yourself looking at people who are on the left and the right of you. So if you have just started out and you can't get a hold of people like B Diamondhead or Lunga Ntila or any of these other people that are considered, kind of pioneers or people that are leading in their respective fields, look at the people on the left and the right of you. So collaborate laterally or horizontally rather than vertically, because those people are harder to get a hold of. They're working in a professional capacity, which means they have less time and energy to devote. And I guarantee you there are people on your left and on your right that are very willing, whether it's a makeup artist or a stylist, to create the work, and you grow together rather than, trying to reach for the sun, moon, and stars, and those people seem inaccessible. Cool. I see a question already. Someone has, panographer has asked, advice on the keynotes, keywords when it comes to your research. Sure. So I think what's important to understand is, before you've even started to pull visual references, is consume, like I said before. And you can use PowerPoint or Keynote, or you can physically cut out things from a magazine. What's important is for you to understand, before you've even started to shoot, how all of these elements come together. Your location, is it indoor? Is it studio? If it's studio, are you building a set, or is it a white backdrop? Is it a red backdrop? Color theory comes into play. What do colors mean in the concept of that? Because when you start to brief everyone else who's going to help bring your vision to life, the more detail you can give them, the better, because that will kind of expand their minds to reinterpret some of your ideas and improve on them, and add that sense of collaboration. And because collaboration is a synergy, it's 1 + 1 = 3, where the sum becomes greater, or the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts, rather. And that's going to mean you sending, that PDF presentation, whether it's Keynote or PowerPoint. And there is, again, no wrong or right way to do it. As long as you can communicate your ideas effectively, you can do it in any way, shape, or form. You could do it with voice notes. You could do it with video references. You could do it with screenshots from films, or shots of a cartoon or old magazines or new magazines. It's just a way for you to put your idea together and compose it. So I hope that answers the question for you, Panographer. The next element that I want to speak to is producing. And for me, producing is about planning and scheduling. And I did a shoot this past weekend where it was all about speaking to, how do I put it, all the elements that I needed. So I needed a makeup artist, I needed a stylist, and I needed a studio. And I did a lot of the production myself. So I sent briefs based on that creative treatment or creative direction to all of those people the week or 2 weeks before that. And then they came back with ideas of how they would interpret some of that work. And then once I booked the models, which were, it was a free shoot, so no one was making any financial remuneration. I just made sure there was food and water and transportation for everyone involved because it was the least that I could do, because I was asking people to work for free. So once all of those elements came together, it was quite challenging because when you work for free you have to work around schedules, but everyone bought into the vision, and that's what sustained us through that shoot. So that aspect of it is production, which is the scheduling and the planning and the booking and calling in favors to make sure that when everyone shows up to the set, that everything works. And if everyone can't get to the set, is making a plan to drive them there, to Uber them there, and to handle all of those elements to make everyone's lives easier, so that the shoot goes off in a smooth, chilled manner, which doesn't always happen because wardrobe can be late, a makeup artist can be delayed by something, and that's when you kind of have to get into problem solving mode. There's so many other elements that come into it outside of just clicking, shooting, and hoping for the best. Okay, going through some of your comments, so I appreciate that very much. Again, pre-production. And I'm going to speak about the frame that you see there is something that I photographed with Shelly Mokwena for her brand and her fashion line. And what we did was she was visiting her family in the Vaal, and I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to shoot somewhere I'm not familiar with. So I gave her a call a couple of days before about where we should meet. I asked her to think about places that would be really great for the idea that you wanted to execute, because her clothing has these really vibrant but pastel colors, and it's really exuberant, if I can use that term. So she became what would traditionally be a location scout, and she fed me these locations in and around the Val about this place might be cool. I know this guy over here is always feeding his sheep at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And for this shoot, we used those elements, and they became really important in executing the idea and using it to the full. All right, and then moving on to the actual production. So the image for those on Facebook and Instagram Live, well, rather not Instagram Live, for Facebook and YouTube Live, is from a shoot that I did called No Borders. And this shoot was, again, when we had the opportunity as Sony ambassadors to test out the Sony 7C. We looked at shooting in various environments. And what's great about the 7C as a camera is that it's the world's lightest mirrorless camera. So we shot in the middle of CBD in Johannesburg, which is not always the greatest place to shoot in because of how busy and the hustle and bustle, and there's some safety concerns sometimes. But using a camera like the Sony 7C made it really fluid and easy because it's such an inobtrusive camera. It doesn't take up too much space. It made the process really fun and really easy. And I was shooting on a kit lens from Sony, which was the 50mm FE 1.8. And we still got great results. And what I wanted to do is kind of bring in street fashion into the real world, or rather that fashion or high-end photography into the real world. And no better place to do that in South Africa than a place like Braamfontein. So all of the pre-production we had done, I went and scouted this yellow wall that you see in the portraits, and I looked for certain elements that I knew would execute on certain shots that I wanted to do. And again, there will never be a substitute for research and planning, because once all of those fears are relayed, it becomes much easier for you to execute on creativity and be spontaneous when you've got the bedrock of research and preparation on your side. The next element I want to talk about, which is often neglected, is post-production. And that's where you start to use programs like Lightroom and Photoshop and InDesign and work with those to finalize your vision. So what happens a lot of the time is, and I advise you to do this if you're going to be shooting a really complex scene or elements that are going to be very complicated, is use plates. And by plates, I mean shoot the location without the models and get the plates, and then start shooting the models in that context. Because when you're in post-production or editing your photos and color grading, it becomes easier to remove elements and work with elements that's just going to make you executing on your vision so much more fun and interesting. And even this shot that's up on the screen is a photograph that I took with a model called Uzintle. And we shot this in how would I put it? In a very busy place. So there were a lot of elements behind her with posters and things like that that I didn't want in the portrait. So I found a piece of the wall that was clean, but we couldn't shoot with her because there was an obstacle. And I shot that plate, and then I shot Zintle again in a different part of the wall. And then what I did is mask it out just so that I could get that tiled effect that I wanted without having to worry about having inappropriate posters that get posted all around Joburg. If you know, you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, that's again the post-production process. Very, very important in making sure that your vision is finalized and you can bring it to its full potential. I think a lot of the time what we miss out on is that post-production is an afterthought. And what I'm going to do is actually share some pre-production images of where the inspiration came from, the production elements of what the photo shoot elements looked like unedited, and the post-production of what something looks like after you've applied some editing techniques to it. And it will show you kind of in the 3 steps how differently you can go from the reference or the inspiration for the thing you're shooting to the process of you shooting in camera to what it looks like after a bit of post-production through elements like Lightroom or Photoshop, which are kind of the predominant ones. And it just kind of will help you to understand how differently things can come out in the end, but understanding it from the get-go. Okay, and next slide. So this was a kind of a sneak peek that the world hasn't seen from a recent shoot for a magazine. And I'm not going to say what magazine it is, but there's a lot more in store when it comes to that. So make sure you look out for it. And what I wanted to do now is get into the Q&A and really, yeah, kind of expound on any of the elements that I've spoken about because there are so many questions. So give me a sec to jump onto some of these questions. The first one is from Thomas99. Let me just see what Thomas is saying. What inspired you to choose fashion and portrait photography? Well, Thomas, what inspired me to choose fashion and portrait photography was a lot of the shoots that I aspire to work on and the kind of work I wanted to create just didn't feel like it existed in a very representative and diverse way. So I've been a fan of Vogue magazine in all of its iterations and Harper's Bazaar and all of these things. And I started researching or just like consuming those things a lot in around 2010. I was one of, the early Tumblr kids and the early Tumblr people that were consuming all of this stuff in this aggregated and fantastic form called blogging back then. And a lot of the stuff I saw was so beautiful and so inspirational, but it just didn't look like who I was. And so I started, borrowing cameras from friends. And I remember one of the early cameras I borrowed from a friend of mine was a very old, tiny Sony zoom camera. And what he did was let me use it on weekends. And I would go to places like Neighborhoods and Maboneng and try to find the most interesting street fashion that people would garb and wear of themselves. And I was just inspired by seeing people that look like me dress in all of these funky ways. And, you know, it was just a way for me to kind of show the world that South Africa has its own voice and its own style. And that's actually where the name The Expressionist came from. It was from me taking in all of these elements and starting to work out what narrative I wanted to tell. And, you know, it's evolved since then. But back then, my biggest goal was to show black and brown faces in ways that the world hadn't really seen from us. And I remember there were other photographers that, you know, were also just starting out, like the I See a Different You guys. There was Jeff Loves Photography. There were a number of us, and it's just amazing now to see 10 years later that how much things have evolved and how many different kinds of styles and genres of photographer where people aren't classified as just black photographers. There are people that work as event photographers and fashion photographers and portrait and documentary and you know, a plethora of other things. It's starting to have the nuances that it deserves, where everyone is not just lumped into one space. And that, you know, was unheard of 10 years ago. I didn't even have people to assist for back then. I just kind of had to figure it out using tutorials and YouTube and any books that I could find and, you know, learn through trial and error. And I'm happy to say now that I work with a number of young people, particularly young black and brown people who don't have the access to a lot of the equipment and the opportunities that I've stumbled into through, you know, a lot of it is pure luck. I won't just put it on talent. And now there's an opportunity to upskill and make sure that this next generation of younger people progress in a much smoother, in a much quicker way. And it's just an exciting an opportunity to be able to be part of that. So hopefully that answers your question, Tom99. The next question is from Kinsani, and she's asked, "How long have you been shooting for?" So I think I've kind of given myself away by saying 10 years. Yeah, it's about 10 years of shooting intermittently, and it's been an interesting journey. I'm also giving away my age, but you know, c'est la vie. Black don't crack, I hope. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey through that 10 years. But preceding that, I was in advertising. I worked as a copywriter and a creative director towards the end of my career in advertising. And I will say that it was challenging, but there was so much I learned about the processes of commercial photography. And a lot of those processes that I learned, I brought into my practice as a photographer and film director. And I will say everything that you learn on your journey as a creative practitioner or creative director or photographer is going to benefit you at some stage. So don't feel as though anything in your process along the way to you realizing your end goal or your dream is a waste of time. You know, there were days where I'd sit and have to work on compositions with my art director, and I hated every moment of it. But so much of that informed my eye and understanding good composition and experimenting and understanding how many elements can go into making really good work. And all of those steps were kind of laying the groundwork for me to get where I want to. So I hope that it answers your question, Kensani. Someone has asked, why am I not on YouTube? I'm shy, but you know, look out. Maybe in the next, in 2021, I'll come out with a YouTube page and hopefully I'll be braver. But I think 2020 has deflated any wind in my sails for starting a YouTube page. But yeah, thanks for asking that question, NQF Visuals. Moving on to the next question. This is from Mohammed. What entry-level camera from Sony should I be getting for street fashion photography? So Mohammed's basically asking about, what entry level or semi-pro camera he should get. And without, you know, being too biased as a Sony ambassador, I will say the Sony 7C is a godsend. I mean, it's lightweight, it's the eye autofocus, the color science in the camera, the fact that it uses, you know, the same mounts as the A7 III and the A7R4 and the A7S III and all of these other Sony cameras means you're going to have access to G Master Prime lenses. You're going to have access to kit lenses. but it's still going to give you incredible quality. And a lot of this work that I've showed you today, about 80% of it has been shot on the Sony A7C. So for me, that's a great kind of intermediary camera that's not exactly entry level, but it's not, an A9, but it'll give you a lot of the elements that you need to do work that is professional and that delivers important or impeccable quality. That's the word I was looking for. Um, Someone said they need me on the show. Okay, let's talk about it. NQF Visuals. I am committing to coming onto your show and having a conversation anytime you're ready. Jumping on to the next question from Al. Does this kind of lens, or does the kind of lens I use matter? What are your favorite focal lengths? So she's just asked what lenses I like to use and if lenses matter. And I will say yes. So depending on your focal length, you can literally change how a person's face looks and distorts. If you're using a super wide lens, like a 16 millimeter lens, and you're trying to shoot portraiture, you're not going to get the same treatment as someone shooting a 50 mm lens, which is closer to the human perspective and how we see the world. So lensing definitely does matter depending on, how experimental you want to get. And the nice thing about fashion photography is that you don't have to be bound by the rules and practices of a lot of conventional photography. So I've done a lot of shoots where I'm shooting portraits on super wide and it compresses differently, or I shoot telephoto to get really nice bokeh. So it does matter, but I think what should drive that is your concept and your idea rather than looking at a lens as the leading thing. But my favorite focal lengths are definitely, I love using two lenses, the G Master 24 to 70 for its versatility and just the tack sharpness of it, and the newly launched 14 to 24 G Master. Because I also do like to experiment with motion blur in photographs and creating a simulated softness, and playing around with different elements that feel very different but still are going to deliver on a very professional level. Um, I'm looking at a question here. What is your take on Afrofuturism? I think Afrofuturism is a cool subgenre that has had a lot of airtime and a lot of time in the sun, especially in that Afro punk era of a couple of years ago. I have no qualms about it, but I do think that there's so much more to being a black creative or a brown creative in this country and even around the world, where you don't have to be limited to thinking, oh, the only genre I can do is Afrofuturism because it's garnered a lot of traction and interest. I think what's important is for you to look at what voice do you speak in, what inspires you, what elements and creativity do you take in, and then use that as your guiding light, because that's going to inform the genre that you take it to. Afrofuturism in reinterpreted could become neo Afrofuturism or post neo modern, whatever you want to make of it. Do not limit yourself to genres and to doing things just because they're popular. Speak from a voice where you're passionate about something and that thing matters to you. And we've got a question from Tori. So, how did you break through into the fashion photography space? Like I was saying earlier, Tori, so I was fortunate in that the internet was my breakthrough. I didn't have much assistance and help from it and other elements and other people. I just picked up a camera and started shooting, and I figured it out along the way. And I will say that never be afraid to just start. Whatever you do, just start. I know I've spoken a lot about the process and the nitty gritties, and that can become overwhelming. But, one of my first shoots, I was doing some of these elements without realizing, where I picked up a camera, I called the model, I asked them to show me some of their outfits. I thought of a place to shoot it, and that's what we did. And that's a very basic or rudimentary way of doing what I do now. But a lot of the same principles still apply. The only thing that changes is that you bring in more collaborators for bigger ideas to execute on a bigger vision as you go along. But do not stop yourself from just starting and failing forwards if you have to, and shooting and experimenting. Because if you actually see some of my very first shoots, I still have them on hard drives, but they make me cringe. And I think that's just an element of being a creative, is that, you look at your past work and you feel like, what was I thinking? What was that? And that's a good thing, because it shows you that your eye is refining and you're progressing and you're evolving as a creative person, or as an artist, or as a photographer or creative director. So my advice to Al about breaking through into fashion photography is just to start and shoot the things that you're passionate about and that interest you. And don't be afraid to experiment and try new things. Um, because I think the longer you do it and the more successful you get, there is a danger of you being trapped in a genre, or in a style, because that's what's made you popular. But I say always break out of that. As a creative person, you should feel like every shoot is trying something new, and it's scaring you, and there's a level of risk in that. And I think that's what being a creative person is. It's an adventure and it's a risk. Great. Someone said, sorry if I'm going off topic. Um, what are what's your take on doing street or fashion photography in Cape Town, um, in dangerous areas or impoverished areas with expensive equipment? I think what's far more important there is always approaching your photography in a respectful way. Because of the country we live in, sometimes you will have to be very cautious. And shoot, run and gun. But my advice would be, if you can engage the community before shooting, on an ethical level. So visit the place without your expensive equipment, talk to community leaders, speak to the people of the place and let them know what you're doing, especially if you're going to profit off of the work, which inevitably you will do. I think it's important to express that in that community respectfully and get the permission, and that will go a long way in securing your safety. And if they say no, that's also perfectly fine. Find a new location. I think a lot of the time, as photographers, we have a tendency to be invasive, where we want to move into spaces and places, shoot our thing, and then disappear off into the sunset and have a great exhibition or photo book. And I think that's not the way that we should approach things any longer. I think there should be a level of community involvement, especially if it's commercial work. And if there's a way to collaborate with those communities and give them, if you ever do publish or exhibit that work, give them some form of remuneration for having used them in the shoots, if you're doing that, or using their communities, to some degree, if that's possible. I think that's a new school way of approaching things. Whereas in the past, people would shoot and be gone, and they would see themselves blown up to a zero. So that's kind of the way that I think we should approach it. In more commercialized areas where it doesn't have a tinge of like exploitation to it, shoot in that location without asking, ask for forgiveness rather than permission. But by and large, I would say be responsible if you're shooting in quote unquote impoverished areas because you want it to look edgy. Communicate with the people of that place, and show them, that decorum and respect. Okay, what other questions? Alex Digitals asked about studio sessions and what equipment to use for lighting. So, I mean, ironically, I like to use natural light if the studio allows for it, but I do think that it doesn't, the studio lights that you use are kind of immaterial, to a certain extent, but my go-to have been the B1s, just because they're more tactile and mobile. And again, I think it also depends on your budget. So if you can't afford to rent out B1s, find something within your budget. And what's more important is how you use them. So how you diffuse the light if they're very harsh, if they're not powerful enough. How do you bounce lights? How do you use reflectors and all of those elements to make sure that you're getting the most out of the equipment that you do have? Okay. Lungas has asked, was it difficult? Oh, I need a new glasses prescription. Was it difficult for you to transition from commercial photography to fine art? If so, what are some of the challenges? I definitely, I think transitioning between fashion and commercial photography is really, really easy. Fine art is kind of the difficult one because it lives on an island on its own. And even in the fine arts world, photography is considered the ugly stepchild of the creative executions. But a lot of the challenges, again, were around creating work that feels exclusive. So a lot of fine art institutions like art galleries and collectors want a level of inaccessibility to the work, and photography is kind of the cornerstone of the advent of the internet. Wherever you look, platforms like Pinterest, Facebook, Instagram all rely by and large on photography. So it makes it a very difficult thing to do. But I think there's this quote that I've always loved that says, "Be so good that you can't be ignored." And I think for photographers that want to break into that fine art space, create bodies of work that you manage access to, but you still make available to a certain degree through your platforms, whether that's your website or your Instagram or whatever the case is. But also have work that it exists outside of the internet, because there is, as a photographer, very few pleasures as rewarding as seeing your work in a gallery printed in the physical form existing in someone's home. And I've invested in a few works that I would recommend you look out for, like Lungantila's work. If you're ever looking to get a print, get in there. I've got 3 or 4 pieces in my house. I've got Andile Buka's work in my house, and it's investing in those, because the more of us are consuming that work, the more we create a demand for it. So I think sometimes it's not even relying on the fine arts world; it's creating your own communities of people to consume the thing that you're doing and speak directly to that market. And that's the advice that I'd give around trying to transition into that fine arts world. Okay, looking at questions once again. Um, Amelia has said, "What has been your favorite shoot to have worked on?" Amelia, I'd say my favorite shoot to have worked on was doing a shoot for Faculty Press, which is Tebe Magugu's um, annual magazine, and that work being so appreciated that Vogue Italia and Vogue magazine got in touch and asked to republish some of that work. And that shoot we did on location in Randburg, in an open field. Collaborated with this creative director slash stylist named Amy Zama, and that was probably one of my favorite shoots because that work has really been consumed and celebrated all across the world. Um, Various people have purchased it who are artists that I respect. And yeah, it was just the process of that shoot was also really kind and gentle. And the shoot was about how young people are trying to navigate finding new forms of spirituality that exist outside of the dogma and the confines of religion. And we kind of created these characters that we photographed. So that was probably my favorite shoot to date. So some of it is on my Instagram, but you can visit the Faculty Press website and consume it there. Cool. Looking at more questions. Hello from the Netherlands, and that's Wesley. Um, Cool. So someone has asked, NQF Visuals has asked about the importance of a portfolio and what to put in it. So the way that I work it, again, there's never any hard and fast rules to a lot of this. It's really down to your own interpretation. So I'm going to give you mine and use elements of that make sense to you. And what I do is I have separate portfolios. So I have a commercial photography portfolio, and that's for shooting work that's going to be on billboards or shooting for a bank or shooting products. It's going to be when I'm working often with commercial enterprises or brands or advertising agency. And there's a specific portfolio that I have that I send to them. And what I also do is something called a tour, an agency tour or an agency roadshow, where you create a physical portfolio. You set an appointment with someone called an art buyer at various agencies, And once you've set that appointment, you visit them and physically show them your work. And that's a great way to make physical contact and communicate with those people. Now that we're living through COVID, that's probably going to be harder. So your best bet is to get that art buyer's email address, send them a PDF, and later on maybe set up a Zoom or a Teams call or a WhatsApp call to take the agency through that. But that's been a great way to secure and get yourself seen by people that work in the commercial space. And then there's my website, and my website, I'd say, is a mix of these things. It's kind of my favorite projects across commercial, fine arts, and fashion, and that's just kind of to show people your versatility and, yeah, a kind of one-stop go-to shop for your work. And then there's the fine art work, which is particularly geared towards the art galleries and the art institutions that want a very different kind of work from what you would do for commercial brands. So my advice is think about each of those and what you shoot, and maybe all three apply to you like they do to me. If they don't, think about the one that does apply to you and create that portfolio and do a bit of research into where those people exist, the galleries, the curators, if it's fine art, the advertising agencies, if it's commercial, and the publications, if it's fashion. And that, can be the Vogues, the Harper's Bazaars, whatever the publications are. And there's a plethora of digital publications that you shouldn't underrate, because it's also a great way to get your work out there. Okay, Tabo Lens has asked what your thoughts are based on natural light and winter and summer. That's a really good question. I was recently in the United States, in New York, for about 3 months, and I was there during winter, and it was so interesting because light on the northern hemisphere is so much softer and so much more diffused than what we have to deal with, being where we are in South Africa at the southernmost tip of the continent. But for me, it's being patient if you're working with lights in the harsh conditions that we have in South Africa. So if you want, softer light, just wait. Either shoot very early morning, and once it hits about 11 to about 1 o'clock, the harsher the light's going to get, especially around midday, and the shadows are going to be harsh. But then if you wait it out until about 2, 3 o'clock again, you're going to be working with natural lights. Another trick that you can use is working with something called a scrim, which is a big sheet of diffusion, which basically works the same way as a diffuser would in a studio light, but you're diffusing the sun. And think about it in the way that how nice light is when the sky is overcast. The clouds act as a natural scrim or diffuser because they make the light cascade and fall in a more natural, even way. So for me, it's those three things. Either be patient and wait for the light to be good. Use a scrim if you're constrained for time, and use it as kind of a way to diffuse the light falling through and cascading onto the model. And yeah, those would be my two elements. Or work in the shadows and think again about your locations, and use sun apps to see where light is going to fall at what time of day before you shoot, so that you don't find yourself wanting to shoot a specific backdrop but the sun is backlit and you're in a tricky position. So I hope that answers your question, Tabulens. Chadley has asked, how did you find your models? How did you go about collaborating with models? And how did you approach? So I approached modeling agencies, sent them my Instagram handle, sent them a portfolio of my work. And I actually did that in New York because I didn't have the network of past models that I have in South Africa. So for that 3 months, I just sent out my PDF to various modeling agencies, and then they would send models my way that they thought would need Z cards or need portfolio work. So that's one option. The other option is through word of mouth and through platforms like Instagram. If you're on the explore page or asking friends, and if you see someone who resonates with something you want to do, pop them a DM, explain what you want to do. And they're either keen or they're not, but you kind of have to be unafraid of putting yourself out there as a photographer, because you're going to experience a lot of rejection. And when I was shooting a lot of street photography in New York. I would ask people, and I even do it in South Africa, of just sometimes walking around with the camera and asking people to take a photograph of them. Some of them say yes, some of them say no, but you have to develop a thick skin as a photographer to just, you'll be surprised how willing people are if you just ask. And if you're politeful, that's not even a word. If you're polite and respectful, that's what I wanted to say. And then Lung is asking, please speak on the importance of playing with other mediums as well. Does that contribute to how you articulate yourself? That's a really great question, Lunga. So I definitely consider myself more of an artist than a photographer. Photography is just a wonderful medium that's given me so many opportunities and trained my eye in a lot of ways. When I work with other visual elements that I experiment with, whether it's illustration or drawing or painting or shooting video, it becomes important to have that basic training that photography has given around composition, shots, concepts, ideas, narrative. All of those things are transferable if you're driven by strong concepts rather than the end product. So I love to, do mixed medium stuff. I love to collaborate with people that do different kinds of work, and we find new ways of working together. I think it's important also if you feel fatigued. So if you're only doing photography, for instance, and you reach a point where you feel like you're burning out or you don't feel like shooting, experiment with something else. You don't have to be good at it. You just have to enjoy it. And it just has to make you look forward to creating again. And that could be through writing. It could be through painting. It could be through illustration. It could be through video work. It could be through whatever the thing is, but find ways to reinvent yourself and to reinvent your desire and passion, because I think really strong creatives are able to transfer their creative work into other mediums. I've been really curious about 3D rendering since lockdown, and I've started with some short courses, which, it's a very different thing to photography in a lot of ways, but in some other ways, it's also very similar. And it's frustrating, and some days you want to pull your hair out, or in my case, my locks out. But you persist and you try. And the more you do that, the better you get at executing on a vision that's not limited to a specific medium. Okay, I'm going to take a few more questions before I end the live. Thank you for all the questions. If you really want to continue this, please find me at my Instagram. That's the Expressionist. And then we can continue the conversation there. I'm always looking to and happy to mentor and answer questions that help you to improve on, lens selection, what camera body that you want to use. And I'm also going to be starting a program of mentorship. So make sure you leave a comment or whatever on the Orms Direct page once we post about that initiative, where you can accompany me on a shoot or two, and all the elements that I've spoken about, we're literally going to go through in the real world and shoot and practice and do all the things for a real shoot. So look out for that as it exists. But in the meantime, let me answer a few more questions. Let me take one last question, maybe. Okay, this is a really nice question here from Hendrik. Does your lens and camera really matter when you're shooting? And I would say, Hendrik, that is a complex but simple question, because yes and no. You want your camera to be reliable and to develop your creative vision in the closest way possible to the thing in your mind. So I love shooting between the A7C and the A7R4 and the A7S III, because they offer such specific features and qualities that help me to execute on specific things in the best way possible. So those things do matter, but they only take you as far as possible, because your ideas and your execution and your creative vision will always override you having the latest equipment or the biggest lens or the most advanced bodies. Those things are great and nice to have, and I will advocate for them, but don't let them limit you with whatever you have, and aspire to those things at a later stage. But make sure that you're always conceptually driven, because that's going to make your life a lot easier. So yeah, thank you for joining me. It's been really fun. Hopefully, we get to do this again very soon. Thanks to Orms Direct, thanks to Sony Alpha, and I've been Anthony Bila on this live stream, um, talking all things photography. And yeah, I was managing 4 or 5 different screens, so excuse me if I haven't been looking at you directly at any time. I think there's about 4 cameras set up on different platforms. But thank you for your time. Thank you for this opportunity, and we will speak soon. Make sure to visit Orms Direct. Black Friday is coming soon. There's going to be some really cool deals and offers on Sony equipment. I'm even kind of, waiting to jump on because there's some new things that I want to get. But yeah, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Arrivederci, sayonara, goodbye, however you want to say it.